name is Chris Hughes. I'm one of the co-founders of Economic Security Project with Natalie Foster and Dorian Warren, and we have been on this journey for almost 6 years at this point, and I'll just say as a point of introduction, it is such a pleasure and very humbling to be in a room like this with so many activists, researchers, scholars, policymakers, all of whom care about creating a guaranteed income now. So thank you all for being here. I have the pleasure of interviewing you a little bit today, Darrick. And for those of you who don't know, Darrick and I have worked together for a little while. I have the privilege of being a senior fellow at Darrick's Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. Thank you. And yet, in preparing for this, I was thinking about what's the most interesting and most important conversation that we can have in this room at this moment and in this time. And I thought we should start off a little bit, not with the policy, but with the personal. I'd love to hear a little bit about your own story, how you came to economics. In many ways, you're a pretty untraditional economist. And how did you find your way to the field, and what's your interaction with economics like today?
Yeah. And first, let me also extend gratitude to be on the stage with you, respect, admiration, and the thing I love most, our friendship. I can say this movement, and it has been a movement, I feel like I've become aware of it maybe 10 years ago, and the clarity, the growth by where we are now versus where we were is dramatic. There's scarcely a place I can go and have a conversation about any policy without guaranteed income coming up. There was a period, I think Dorian Warren might be in the audience, but not so long ago, he pointed out to me, that, what was the debate? Disciplining poor people. The debate was, you can't give poor people money. I remember being in a quick conversation with someone, and they said, well, you're just going to give people money? Why are you going to do that? Because they're poor and they need money. That's why. It's the obvious answer, right? So, but that said, my trajectory here is one of serendipity. I rejected poverty. That's why I wanted to be an economist. I thought that it was a feeder into a discipline, a pathway towards law school, a pathway towards business school. And, growing up, it was the cliche tale of two cities. I had access to an elite private school with people from different backgrounds, wealthier backgrounds, but I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And people have probably heard this about me. Something that's profound to me is I lost my parents at an early age. I lost them when I was in high school. And without a doubt in my mind, I lost them because they worked too hard. And they worked very hard, in part not for themselves, but for legacy of their children. That's not a story of triumph. It wasn't a choice I had. It was a choice they made, but I'm committed to making pathways in this world and structures so that people don't have to make that tragic choice, that we enable people with the necessary resources. So that long-winded question, I promise all my answers won't be this long-winded.
Please.
But the pathway to economics was serendipity. I thought it was the undergrad major to put me in a position so I didn't have to worry about light bills, so I didn't have to worry about phone bills, any other bills. But along that pathway, discovery through programs, social programs. I got access to summer research programs that put me in space with other faculty people, and I saw that I can pursue what was my passion. I'm an intellectual at my heart. I could go be a scholar, make a decent living, and I started to like economics. So again, it was serendipity. I didn't necessarily choose it, but here I am.
So let's talk a little bit about guaranteed income in economics, given that guaranteed income is often unpopular in the academy, particularly with economists. You have a different take. You situate guaranteed income inside a broader vision of an economic Bill of Rights. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about what that means to you and what it could mean for all of us.
Yeah, one way to think of how we want a well-functioning society is ensuring that people have the resources so that they can, with authenticity, reap the benefits of their efforts, reap rewards for their ingenuity. Right now, if there's a rhetoric couched in choice, freedom, but without the necessary resources so that that can be real, it's inauthentic. Anybody who engages in any transaction without power and without resources are subject to two things: the whim of charity, somebody just offering them something out of the goodness of their heart, or the vulnerability of exploitation. That's how power works. So where we are, I think all of us in this room, as well as the Institute and my great colleague Grieve Chelwa is in the audience, where we are is trying to articulate a new vision, one grounded in rights, one grounded in morality, one that says that we're going to ensure that people not just have political rights. Political rights are important: the right to vote, the right to civically engage. Not just have civil rights, the rights to protest, but part of the original Declaration of Human Rights, the critical component that has been left out, that is as important, if not more, economic rights. The right to be in society, and if you're sick, see a doctor. The right to a job. And fundamental to all those rights is a guaranteed income. The right to have some income, some dignity associated with resources to make choices in your life. So ideology, some people may vary on the scheme from capitalist to socialist, and in earnest, those are largely polemic academic topics that are useful for us to understand and shape our economy. But in reality, scarcely in a practical sense has anything been completely socialist or completely capitalist. But irrespective of that ideological spectrum, which should be critical, is economic rights, some base level of resources. So theoretically, guaranteed income is an obvious one to me.
Mm-hmm. And this is an enduring idea. I mean, we've had conversations about economic Bill of Rights since FDR, and the UN has this declaration of human rights, and increasingly they're emphasizing that more these days, right?
Yeah, this is not new. The stuff we're doing is not new, right? This has been in existence. There was certainly a shout out to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the Poor People's Campaign. So this is, for political reasons, we've gotten off course. There's been a capturing of the notion of what power, of what freedom and what choice means, that has just talked about freedom and choice as absence from the tyranny of government. Mm-hmm. So there's been a scapegoating of government, but in reality, this is not new. This is fundamental.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think about economic ideology, and then we'll talk a little bit more about guaranteed income. But the Economic Bill of Rights, some would say that a rights-based framework isn't sufficiently race-forward because it suggests, it doesn't, in its formulation, it isn't anti-racist at the core. I know you don't think that, but how do you see the role of structural racism and white privilege fitting into a broader framework of an Economic Bill of Rights? How do we make sure that's not just left behind?
Yeah, and we had history, we cited history. So there was a period when the U.S. government and our economy was trending towards instilling economic rights. What were some of those examples? Social Security, the right to age-old pension. What was another example? The Wagner Act, the right for labor to collectively bargain against capital to be able to negotiate in better terms. Well, what was absent in all that history? Black people were largely excluded from those policies, for example. You know, Social Security, I think people in this room know, 90% of black women who were employed as a domestic or agricultural worker, and over half of black men. And the original legislation excluded those categories of work. Same with the Wagner Act. This was a design feature that was seemingly race neutral, but in our political context was absolutely not race neutral. So the point is, when we do economic rights, we have to add another word: inclusive economic rights. We have to make sure that when we design, implement, and manage the policies, they're not managed at a Southern Jim Crow local level without discretion of federal oversight to be anti-discriminatory. We need to make sure that by design, management, and implementation, they are explicitly anti-sexist and anti-racist. And those are lessons from the past that we can learn. And then really quick, the other part of the equation from the question you asked, without the economic power to displace despair writ large in society, we will be vulnerable to the lure, the fascist lure of white supremacy. In other words, you can attract a political dominant group who has despair by offering them relative status. However bad your lot in life may be, at least you ain't black. At least you ain't, right? So that we need that ammunition to neuter a white supremacist agenda. Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about guaranteed income as an idea and as a policy proposal. How do we ensure that it fits into that inclusive economic rights? And, in other words, how do we make sure that it's anti-sexist and anti-racist and programmatically as we think about how to design it and where we might want to head from a policy perspective?
And I'm going to give a shout out to you, Chris, because one of the next big papers that Chris is working on is the automatic stabilizing effects associated with programs like guaranteed income. So there's an automatic feature of anti-racism with programs like guaranteed income. You know, the previous panel, Mayor Tubbs referenced, and so did Natalie, eliminating poverty altogether. So if we design a policy that eliminates poverty, and we can do this with the tax code. We can do this with a tax code, and we can talk more about this too, in a way to literally eliminate poverty. As Natalie said, poverty is a political choice. So definitionally, with something like guaranteed income, not only is it an automatic stabilizer to ensure when there's an economic downturn, the federal resources are going to people that need it the most, but it's anti-racist in its design.
Can you just define automatic stabilizer for this crowd? Because I feel like that may be a little bit of economist talk working its way in.
See, Chris keeps me in check when I become an egghead. An automatic stabilizer is a policy that prospectively has in effect counter-cyclical attributes. And
He's trying.
I'm building to this. The economy goes up, the economy goes down. There are recessions and there's expansions, right? And to have, in effect, stabilizers so that people don't suffer so much in those economic downturns, there's a nomenclature in policy called automatic stabilizers. And something like guaranteed income would have, you know, rather than Congress having to retrospectively come up with some policy proposal to deal with a pandemic that we didn't foresee, we would already have in place a policy infrastructure that not only would send resources to people directly, but that would automatically dampen the effects for an economy-wide downturn associated with the pandemic without having to legislate and have that time lag. So that's what makes it an automatic stabilizer. Sign up for my Econ 101 course. No, joke.
With the digital, the MOOC. You know, there are a lot of different ways to design a guaranteed income. As I think everybody in this room knows, obviously there's the universal basic income idea, which has been has gotten a lot of prominent attention. There's the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit idea. There's also this sort of third set of ideas around a negative income tax, which does sound wonky, but I guess what I'm wanting you to talk a little bit about is if you were king for the day or president for the day with a Democratic trifecta and had all the one day, how would you design a guaranteed income and help us understand how affordable and doable is it?
So after I return from Tahiti with my king for the day,
Yeah, okay.
yeah. with the sponsorship of Economic Security Project, we wrote a paper about using the tax code as a mechanism to implement guaranteed income to do multiple things. One, literally eliminate poverty. Literally offer people enough resources so that they are not poor. So again, that's a policy choice. We can do that. Then, not only that, but to lift more families towards the middle class in a stabilizing way. And you know how we can do it? Tax reform. We already have this in place. We have child tax credits. We have the earned income tax credit, which is perhaps one of the more bipartisan policy programs. And the way it got bipartisan was not allowing people who were not working to receive it. We're in a new political trajectory where we can eliminate that work requirement and use the EITC, which is essentially a negative income tax, which is essentially saying we're democratizing the tax code. Everybody pays taxes. Some of us don't have a federal liability. But whether or not you have a federal liability or not, the IRS will include you in the tax code, and some people will receive resources from the IRS. By the way, this is certainly not unprecedented and not limited to the EITC. One of the silver linings of the pandemic was those stimulus checks that went out to Americans readily, and some blips, but honestly, that was dramatic and saved us from a deep depression. We literally hibernated the economy to protect ourselves from the pandemic, and the federal government acted. So they can act. They have power to act. So through tax reform, we could do a couple of things. The earned income tax credit structure, we could shift it up to the poverty line so that everybody starts with a baseline level of income. So that eliminates poverty for everyone. It's not just one of the talking points from Joe Biden, the child tax credit cut child poverty in half. Well, any poverty is an immoral blight. Why just stop at cutting child poverty by half? Why not that seemingly undeserving black man or black woman? Why not cut their poverty out as well? So this literally cuts it out with the tax code. And then the last part is it's not just anti-poverty. If we link the guaranteed income to the median income of the nation, index it, then it lifts all families in an automatic way in perpetuity towards the middle class. So we have the tools to do this. That's what I'm saying.
And how do you think about, what do you say when people say, yeah, but can we afford it? Isn't that expensive?
Yeah, the can we afford it? Yes, again, it's a policy choice. But I had an interview with Ezra Klein, and one of the things that Ezra Klein pointed out in that interview is Americans like their Ubers cheap. We like our goods cheap and plentiful. So I'm not going to pull the wool over your eyes and say that with these anti-poverty programs, some of our way of life won't change. We're going to have to pay more for Uber. We're going to have, right? But it's fair and the right thing to do. So to me, that's a cost that I'm willing to pay. And if we have a moral economy, we all should be willing to pay. But in terms of just nuts and bolts numbers, the federal government is not like your household. The federal government does not have to balance budgets like your household. In fact, if they did balance the budget tomorrow, it would send us into a recession. The federal government should always be investing in not deficit spending that is just inflationary and not productive, but what's more productive than the American people? What is our most treasured resource beyond people themselves? And you all, with your demonstrations, have been showing that. What happens when people have resources? They work more. What happens when people have resources? We have no idea. I can't predict the dynamism that would counteract all these narratives about deficits and costs when we unleash our greatest assets, which is as people. And I really believe in that. This is not just rhetoric. That's one of the reasons why I think we can win this, because I do believe we have truth on our side.
Can you talk a little bit about, you spend most of your time researching, teaching, policy making, and I think a lot of people in this room have some connection to the demonstrations and the pilots that are out there. So can you talk a little bit about what role you see those demonstrations and pilots having in the broader movement, the cultural, economic, political movement for social change and racial justice?
I was just on a panel with Jennifer, and I hope I'm going to mispronounce her last name, apologies, Ngudu, who is at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and a similar question was asked to her. And you know, the big thing is philanthropy needs to do big, bold things, and they do. The money and resources rest with government and corporations. We don't have to rely on corporations because government has a great deal of resources. So what these demonstrations do, these demonstrations, one, demonstrate what you all have been doing, which is the economic narratives about work disincentives associated with offering people cash is a normative view that's not empirically substantiated, that we can have different normative views, and if we go to data, we see that that other normative view is actually wrong. It builds up narratives. It builds up evidence. It builds up political momentum. It empowers us. It empowers us to say, y'all don't know what you're talking about. Look at what's happening. It also creates competition in a positive way. It also shows that if this can happen here, why can't it happen over here as well? But I've led with the preamble of this conversation to make the point that the gold star has to be public power. The gold star has to be to translate this into our government reforming our tax code, even at the local level. There are lots of mayors out here that are doing great work, but the reality is they're limited in their capacity because they do have to balance their budgets, not like the federal government. So the end goal has to be building up a movement, demonstrations, some sacrifices along that way, but ultimately transforming government to fulfill their fiduciary responsibility.
I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk about a cousin idea to guaranteed income, which you've worked a lot on in your career, the idea of baby bonds. I'm curious, before we go there, just maybe a raise of hands, how many people are familiar with what baby bonds are, that work, that movement? Okay, it's a pretty educated crowd here. Although I saw a couple folks not as sure, teetering. So can you talk to us a little bit about what baby bonds are, sure, and where they are in their the political and ideas journey, and then how they would relate to a guaranteed income? Like, can you imagine an America with a guaranteed income and baby bonds? Just how do you think about those things?
Start with one contextual point also. There is no silver bullet policy in America.
Yeah.
There is no silver. So those people that when you're talking about guaranteed income and somebody tries to twist or turn and say, what about this, what about that, say yes. Right? Yes. There are multiple dimensions of human dignity. There are multiple dimensions of economic security. Income is a major one, but not the only one. There's also an asset dimension of economic security. So definitionally, what is an asset? An asset is a stock resource, and here's a key word, that has the possibility of in perpetuity offering returns associated with that stock resource. In other words, once it's used, it's not gone. It is a big resource like wealth. I'm too esoteric. Wealth. Wealth affords you the ability to hire an attorney if you're confronted with an expensive legal system. If you have to do a medical procedure, if you want to send your kids to college, you're not financing this out of income. It is that stock asset of wealth. Wealth allows you to have a store of resource that if there's a pandemic, now if your boss says you got to go in and work, you could say, mm-mm. So wealth is a different dimension of power that's useful. And what baby bonds is as a policy is a birthright to capital. We know that the main mechanism for people to get wealth is wealth itself. It's having a capital baseline to get into an asset like a home, like a college degree without debt so you can get a managerial and professional job, or some capital to start a business and be entrepreneurial. The difference between a worker with a great idea and an entrepreneur with a great idea is capital. So what baby bonds does is another automatic stabilizing policy that says, as a birthright, the U.S. government will endow you with a resource, progressively seeded, so that if you're born in the most wealth-poor family, you'll get the most. We want to make it a stakeholder society, so even the most wealthy amongst us will get some nominal seed, like Social Security. And then when you become a young adult, you have some nest egg so that you can begin at a critical point in your life building economic security over time. The value of a trust fund should not be reserved for the wealthy. We all should have access to trust funds. So, and then anti-racist. It's anti-racist. Like the racial wealth gap, we know it's intergenerational. So this is a prospective tool that, in, again, perpetuity, ensures that regardless of the birth circumstance that you're born into, your gender, your race, et cetera, there's at least some resources that you can begin a life of building economic security.
So you imagine a world with a guaranteed income and baby bonds together, right?
Absolutely. They're complements. Right, there's a wealth and an income dimension. And then, Chris, I talk a lot. Federal job guarantee. You're like, I got you here to talk. Here's one that might be a little more controversial. A federal job guarantee. By the way, Dr. King advocated for a federal job guarantee and guaranteed income. There's dignity in work. All our dignity doesn't come from work, but there's value in being able to engage with people in reasonable terms in a social setting that should be afforded to all of us. I won't go into all the details of a federal job guarantee, but suffice it to say that an economic bill of rights, a human rights economy, recognizes that there are a set of enabling goods and services without which individuals have limited capabilities of self-determination. A job is certainly amongst them. Income is certainly amongst them. Assets are certainly amongst them. The ability to see a doctor is amongst them. And then here's one two that I'll say that might not be well known or thought of. The ability, free mobility in society without the threat of detention or bodily harm because your identity is linked to a stigmatized group. That's an economic right. And one more, just to shout out, we have a new paper with NELP on something like anti-discrimination enforcement. Right now, you know how we deal with discrimination in the workplace? A worker has the burden, the onerous task of one, identifying that they're discriminated against, and then taking on a system that has discriminated against them. This is a structural problem, discrimination. They're not individual problems, it's a structural problem. So therefore, we need structural solutions. So this paper talks about government, and other entities can do this as well, prospectively auditing a system or prospectively sending out testers to make sure that employers or people that receive procurement are engaged in anti-discrimination. So it uses something from the academy, testers, send out actors and see. Don't tell me you don't discriminate. We're going to test and see if you discriminate. And if you do, then we'll hold you accountable. But it also has the feature of if the uncertainty, if you're not sure you're going to be tested or audited, then you're going to engage in good practices, or you'll be incentivized to do so.
So I have two last questions, and then we'll see the stage. The first is, how do you, it sometimes feels like there's a language of morality in what we owe one another. We must abolish poverty. And then there's an economics language, which is about technical things, automatic stabilizers or asset buildings, this and that. You have this unique talent of fusing both of those languages, those conceptual frameworks, and I think a lot of us are in awe of it and would love to be able to do that better. So how do you do that? How do you manage not to just sort of speak in two languages but fuse them together? It's another way of saying, what would a moral economy look like, and how can you teach us to talk about it more similarly to the way you do?
Yeah. My colleague Grieve Chelwa tells the story of why he came to the Institute He saw a video of me one time talking about the economy in a plain way, and he got pissed off. He said, this is what I've been taught in graduate school. So, and then luckily for me, he gravitated towards the Institute. Similar scenario for me. PhD graduate course, and I heard the professor say this. We're talking about macroeconomics. He said, math trick. That pissed me off. Math trick? We're talking about people's lives. So I admire the economics profession for using math because it rigorously focuses our conceptual framework, because math is, a rigorous language. But the economics profession purporting to everybody as if it's strictly scientific, that's a lie. The discipline begins with a set of norms. The two fundamental theorems of economics are grounded in a normative perspective of how value should be determined, fairness, distribution, etc. Guess what? We get to choose. We get to decide the normative economy that we want, and then we can apply the rigor. Rigor's important. Then we can come up with the policies, but we really do get to choose. So we can choose a moral economy if we want. So that's the aspect, the scientific notion that economics is just science and should not go challenged, et cetera. That's a problem, and that's something we need to contest.
Excellent. So my last question is, I'd love for you to talk about a book or an article or a person, something that has inspired you that can help us get to know you a little bit better and maybe leave us with something that we can look forward to.
You inspired me, and that's the truth. Other people in this audience inspire me. I've been yelling at y'all a lot during this presentation. I just realized that. So I love this levity to end on. But of course, even in levity, I got to find things that aren't so kind. The article, Property Rights and Whiteness, by the critical race theorist Cheryl Harris, is fundamental. I thought I was on to stuff in my economic work of how my discipline treats something like discrimination that to me has been so rational and intentional in American history as just grounded in bigotry, ignorance, taste, and preferences. I was like, that can't be right. Well, Cheryl Harris in her article articulates why it's not right, that there is psychological and material benefits about using a political apparatus to structure something like identity in a way to favor one group at the expense of another. That's immoral, but that article is eye-opening. A book that's also eye-opening is Ira Katznelson, When Affirmative Action Was White. Because I've been parroting a lot that came out of that book to you all when I talk about economic rights that are anti-racist, anti-sexist. Ira Katznelson describes how the U.S. government implemented the GI Bill, FHA loans, in a way that was intentionally racist by its design, by its implementation, and its management. So we can extrapolate from that how we can do it in a way that's not racist. So those were formative books and articles in determining who I am, but I wish I had something more levity to end on.
That was pretty good.
That was pretty good, all right.
Thank you, Darrick.
Thank you, Chris.